Hello and welcome to our special show on the upcoming general budget. I am Vishal Dahiya and the countdown for the general budget had started. On 5th of July, the new Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman will present the first full-fledged budget of the second term of Narendra Modi-led NDA government. In the run-up to this budget, we will discuss the challenges for the new Finance Minister, and the new government will also try to analyze the financial condition of the different sectors of the industry and their aspirations, and will try to take stock of the social sector schemes and other related topics as well. In our show today, we'll focus on the key subjects of overall growth, fiscal deficit, employment and investment. I have with me three special guests in the studio today for this, and let me start by introducing them to you, beginning with Mr. Ajay Shankar, former Secretary, DIPP from the Ministry of Commerce and Industry. We also have with us Mr. Jayant Dasgupta, former Ambassador of the WTO, and we also have with us Senior Economic Journalist Mr. Bhattacharya, who is the Editorial Director of Business Standard. But first, let's take a look at some details of the GDP figures as well as fiscal deficit. Let's begin with GDP. Although India has been termed the fastest growing economy in the world with an annual growth rate of 7.2%, the road ahead is full of challenges. An indication of this came in the last 4 quarters that saw a constant decline in the GDP numbers. In the first quarter of the financial year 2018-2019, the growth was 8%, but in the second quarter, it fell to 7%. In the third quarter, it further slipped to 6.6%, and in the fourth quarter, it could only manage 5.8%. Now, let's take a look at the fiscal deficit numbers. Now, the first term of the Modi government saw it keeping a tight grip on the fiscal discipline. Succeeding budgets gradually reduced it and brought it in the range of 3.5%. The objective was to bring it further to 3.3% of the GDP. If you look at the last 5 budgets, then the fiscal deficit has been reduced from 4% in 2014-2015 to 3.4% in 2018-19. But given the fall in GDP growth, the government has the challenge to give that extra push to the economy, and in such a situation, it has a difficult task of maintaining growth and not exceeding the deficit target as well. So let's begin the discussion, and let's first take up the GDP. That's the overall growth. Let me bring you in, Mr. Bhattacharya. The GDP numbers have fell in the last few quarters, but overall, it has been above 7%, and the outlook which has been given by several rating agencies is also looking pretty good. So how do you see things moving here onwards as far as the overall GDP is concerned?
Well, I think the long-term outlook is what you are suggesting. But if you look at the short-term projections, if you look at what the RBI governor, Shaktikant Das, mentioned in his monetary policy review, he actually admits that the economy has lost its traction, in a sense that the economy has entered a phase where a growth slowdown is likely to happen at least in the next couple of quarters. Okay. 5.8%, and even the government's own economists don't expect that this recovery can take place in the first 2 quarters, because as you know, the economic engines run on 2 major factors. One is consumption, the other is investment, and both these areas are showing signs of weakness. Okay. So therefore, the budget has a very, very, very major challenge, and the dilemma before the finance minister, as I see it, would be Mrs. Sitharaman has to budget for growth, but cannot rely on the growth numbers for our revenues. Okay. So because if you have good growth, then you can rely on good revenue numbers by which you can finance your investments, expenditure, etc. Okay. But if your growth is decelerating, then you cannot probably project robust revenues. So therefore, the big challenge would be what are the kind of sectors that she looks at to supplement revenues, whether it will be asset sale or whether it will be some sort of transfer of reserves from Reserve Bank of India, is something that our budget will show. But I think our biggest challenge would be in a scenario of decelerating growth, how can she make sure that the revenue numbers are kept at a level where the government can spend adequate resources to keep the growth momentum going.
Okay, Mr. Dasgupta, do you agree that this is going to be the biggest challenge?
Yes, the problem is that consumption is slowing down, and apart from attracting investments, one of the most important things which the government has to do is to encourage consumption. And the Kisan Samriddhi Yojana, for instance, 6,000 rupees for farmers in the rural areas, that is something which needs to be accelerated. It was to be given in 3 installments. Then the MNREGA, entitlement, that allotments to the states and the states' own contributions, that has to go up in order to generate rural employment.
Okay.
We are going to see a drought-like condition in many of the states, and there will be a lack of employment for the landless labor, and that is what needs to be filled in, and the government needs to spend more.
Okay.
So this is the second part, and the third part is, of course, that if infrastructure is also built, it will stimulate employment and it will stimulate growth.
Okay, so infrastructure, generation of jobs, and what Mr. Bhattacharya also pointed out, ensuring that revenue is maintained at that particular level. Mr. Shankar, you've been in the government at a key post as well, and this you would remember, this would not be the first time wherein you have seen the weakness in the growth numbers in the short term, but we have the long-term outcome as well, long-term projections as well, which are not that weak. But as Mr. Bhattacharya is pointing out, instantly, if you look at this budget, then these are going to be the key challenges which needs to be addressed.
My own view is that there should not be too much anxiety about the slight decline in the growth rates. And it would not be advisable to use a fiscal stimulus to somehow get higher GDP growth numbers in the short run. I think the most important task before the government is, and I hope the budget would try and address it, is actually a big bang effort to set the financial sector of the country right. So if the banks have to be recapitalized, I would prefer using a very high fiscal deficit to do it at one stroke, irrespective of what the government is able to get out of the RBI. Through the Jalan Committee. Similarly, the NBFC sector needs again a major bold treatment to get it back on its feet. Because till the financial sector comes back to normalcy, we will not be able to see the kind of economic momentum that we've seen in the past. So if in the first 2-3 quarters of this financial year, if the financial sector is brought back to normal, that is, the banks are fully recapitalized, the NBFCs are back to normal, the anxiety about housing finance companies and others is set right, whether they are taken over, whether new management is brought in, whether the banks are more aggressive.
So it will lay a strong foundation for the next few quarters.
So I would suggest that if that is done with vigor and energy, and we see results in the next 2-3 quarters, then higher growth rates will follow and a stimulus if necessary.
So everything is interconnected. So is the growth and fiscal discipline as well, and that's what I'm coming to right now. And quickly, if you look at Mr. Bhattacharya, in such a scenario where the growth is slowing down, so the government will have to give that push to the economy, as all of you have suggested. In that situation, to maintain that fiscal discipline is going to be another challenge for the new finance minister.
I think the government should maintain fiscal discipline. But the fiscal discipline doesn't necessarily only come from your fiscal deficit number. The fiscal deficit number, in my view, in a country like India, is actually increasingly becoming one of the many factors that contribute
to the fiscal discipline.
To fiscal discipline. For example, we have seen in the last few years the growing importance of off-budget borrowings that actually in effect are masking the actual extent of fiscal deficit or fiscal discipline. So therefore, it will be important to control those off-budget borrowings as well, apart from ensuring that fiscal discipline, the number that we're talking about, which is what they're saying 3.4% of GDP, should also be honored. So we need a holistic and a more healthy approach to addressing the concerns of fiscal discipline, not by just adhering to that headline number of fiscal deficit as percent of GDP, but also to look at what are the kind of off-budget borrowings done through public sector undertakings. They are under check, so that the crowding out of the system through government borrowing or the government entity borrowing is reduced as far as possible.
Okay, so they will have to look at the fiscal discipline in its entirety. Mr. Dasgupta, if you look at the fiscal discipline or fiscal deficit numbers of the Prime Minister Modi-led government's first tenure, that's NDA 1 from 2014 to 2019. Now, in those years, we've seen there was a gradual decline and there was a tight grip on the fiscal deficit numbers. So that should not be, a cause of concern this time around as well.
I think there were a few things going for the government. For instance, oil prices were not very high, and with the Middle East crisis now, with sanctions against Iran, there could be some problems with the oil budget. And in any case, the global economy is also showing signs of slowing down, apart from our own economy, which is definitely has slowed down in the last 2 quarters. So we have to, we should not be bound down by a very strict discipline of 3.3% or 3.4%. I think if we need to allay rural distress, if we need to keep the wheels of progress moving, we can cross that number. And as the previous speakers have mentioned, the Jalan Committee's recommendations about utilizing the money available with the RBI, that can provide additional resources to the government to spend.
Okay. Mr. Ajay Shankar, concluding comments from you on the fiscal discipline aspect. As Mr. Bhattacharya pointed out, we'll have to look at it in a holistic way, not only those numbers.
We should look at it in a holistic way, but my view is that the fiscal deficit should be breached only to set right the financial sector. Otherwise, fiscal discipline should be maintained. But government should look at the private sector and look at PPPs again to kickstart infrastructure investment. The government could review the PPP experience and see how to get more private investment into infrastructure, which would give a stimulus to the economy and higher growth rates.
Okay, so it's basically more investment and stimulus to the economy. Mr. Bhattacharya?
Yeah, I entirely agree with Mr. Shankar. I think if at all the fiscal deficit has to be breached, it must be made sure that the extra money or the slippage that is taking place results in corresponding increase in capex budget of the government. The capital expenditure budget has not been growing as a percent of GDP in the last 2-3 years. It is time that we increase the capex budget as a percent of GDP, not in absolute terms, as a percent of GDP, so that the stress in the system is relieved and the outcry that will naturally arise out of a fiscal deficit expansion will be to some extent countered by the argument that the extra money is not going for meeting your revenue expenditure, but meeting capital expenditure, which will create assets and hopefully create more jobs and revive growth.
Okay, Mr. Dasgupta, one last concluding comment from you that, in terms of both the GDP numbers, which needs to be increased, maintain the growth, increase it rather, and the fiscal discipline as well, quite intertwined altogether, and these will be the 2 biggest challenges.
Yes, definitely so. And I think the way to bridge this is to go in for infrastructure spending, and that will create jobs, that will create demand, consumption will go up, and that will give a stimulus to the economy. But as pointed out earlier, the banking system has to be put on an even keel once again, and the Jalan Committee's recommendations, people are looking forward to that. That will probably help in this direction. Okay,
so clearly, as our panelists have pointed out, as far as these 2 aspects are concerned, that is ensuring that the growth rate gradually increases and the fiscal discipline is adhered to. There are several challenges for the new finance minister and the new government. Let's wait for the first budget of this government to be presented, and we'll have a clear picture, clear idea as to how the new finance minister and the government wants to tackle these challenges. We'll come back again tomorrow and look at some more aspects of the Indian economy, some specific sectors as to what are their aspirations and what are the challenges in those sectors for the government. Till then, keep watching Rajya Sabha Television.